to the Civil Rights Movement of Black Power, 1865-1968. We did class 4 on Saturday. We did class number 1 of Ancient Kemet, the Moors, and the Ma'afa, Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade. We did this on Sunday. And then that class meets on Sundays, 12 noon to 2 p.m. We end up doing 3 hours. As soon as you register, you can watch that class. And we laid a foundation and dealt with some ancient history and dealt with a number of different topics here. And we dealt with a timeline of history. So just to lay a foundation for class number 1. But what I want to do today, I forgot. I want to talk about class number 4 from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement of Black Power. I want to do a quick recap of that. We already did a recap of class number 1 of Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade. I want to do a recap of the class we just had this past weekend from the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement in Black Power, 1865 to 1968. All right, so we deal with history leading up to the Civil War, just to lay a foundation. And then we mainly focus on from 1865 through 1968, Reconstruction era, 1865 to 1877, Jim Crow era. We look at World War I, World War II, Black Power movement, Civil Rights movement. Okay, so we talked about the Fort Pillow Massacre of 1864, led by Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest. Okay, who was also one of the is believed to be the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, Nathan Bedford Forrest. Now, on this show, we've talked about his statue being removed as well. Okay, from the bust of Nathan Bedford Forrest being removed from the Tennessee State House, and that just happened a couple of months ago. All right, there's a good article on this. There's a good article on this here from a source out of Tennessee, okay, that dealt with his bust being removed. But Washington Post has a good article dealing with the Fort Pillow Massacre, okay, the Civil War battle, that left nearly 200 black soldiers murdered. And Nathan Bedford Forrest had a lot of these African-American Union soldiers executed even after they surrendered. Okay. He's just an evil person. The Civil War massacre that left nearly 200 black soldiers murdered. This is something we talked about this past weekend in class. The battle to regain Fort Pillow began April 12, 1864, when Nathan Bedford Forrest, Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest of the Confederacy, led 2,500 Confederate cavalry in an attack on the fort about 40 miles north of Memphis, Tennessee, according to the National Park Service. The fort was held by Union troops, including 295 white soldiers and 262 colored soldiers under the command of Major Lionel F. Booth. The Confederates, including sharpshooters, unleashed a storm of bullets on the fort, killing Booth. Major General Nathan Bedford Forrest demanded unconditional surrender. Although outnumbered by the Confederate soldiers, Major William F. Bradford, who had taken command of the Union troops, refused to surrender. Confederates renewed the attack, soon overran the fort, and drove the Federals down the river's bluff into a deadly crossfire, according to the National Park Service. As many as 300 Union soldiers, including 200 black soldiers, were killed. Many were shot point blank in the head. Many of them were executed. Many were shot point blank in the head. Now, this was under the command of Nathan Bedford Forrest, who would go on to become a prominent Klans member. Mark Lemming was the highest ranking Union officer to survive the battle. His eyewitness account, written nearly 30 years later on April 14th, 1893, would stand as a testament to what happened at Fort Pillow. Okay, so we talked about the Fort Pillow massacre during the Civil War. We talked about how Lincoln was not an abolitionist and dealt with Lincoln and slavery and things like that. We also talked about Special Field Order number 15, 40 acres and a mule, what it was, what it wasn't. And one of the things about it, a lot of people don't know, is that land, it was 400,000 acres of coastal land. 400,000 acres of coastal land is South Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. That land was only supposed to be occupied by African Americans, and we were supposed to govern ourselves. It was supposed to be like a nation within a nation. Lincoln's assassinated. Most of the land is going to be taken back. President Andrew Johnson from Tennessee, who was sympathetic to the Confederacy, took all that land back, gave it back to the plantation owners, to the former slave owners. We also talked about the creation of the Freemans Bureau, the Bureau of Freedmen's, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands, the U.S. Bureau of Freedmen's, Refugees, and Abandoned Lands, created by Congress in March of 1865 to help former slaves and destitute white people as well. We talked about that also, the Freedmen's Bureau. Special Field Order number 15, all of that. Juneteenth we dealt with as well, and why the Emancipation Proclamation did not free the slaves. We're going to this weekend. We also talked about the New York City Draft Riot, July 1863. The New York City Draft Riot, July 1863. We dealt with that as well, because that New York City Draft Riot took place after the Emancipation Proclamation, and you had white men up north in New York City who were going crazy because they had to either get drafted and fight in a war if they were of age, or they could pay a $300 fine and not go to the war, or pay somebody else to take their place in the Civil War. But $300 was that's like the equivalent of about $5,800 today back in 1863. That was the average annual salary of a white man back then. So only wealthy white men could pay that $300 and not go to war. And this caused a lot of this caused a insurrection. It's a New York Draft Riot. And these white men are going, they're killing African Americans, destroying businesses, attacking federal buildings, like the January 6th insurrection. Okay, this is a little known piece of history. And there were draft riots also in Detroit and Boston. New York City was the big one. The New York City Draft Riot was the big one. And after the Emancipation Proclamation, the purpose of the Civil War shifted from bringing the South back into the Union to freeing the slaves. And this caused a lot of backlash from white men, because some of them were saying, well, wait a second, if you free the slaves, they're going to take our jobs, even though the majority of the slaves were in the South. Okay. And a lot of states in the North had already freed the slaves. But some of them were saying, wait a second, if you free the slaves, they're going to take our jobs. Here's an article here from blackpast.org. It deals with the New York City Draft Riots of 1863. And it deals with these attacks. It was anti-Black violence that was taking place in New York City. When the draft came to New York City in July 1863, anti-government anger turned to anti-government and anti-Black violence, kind of like the January 6th insurrection and these white supremacists, the white supremacist domestic terrorists, kind of like them. The anti-Black violence was driven by the resentment that the Irish would have to compete with freed African Americans for jobs in the city of New York now that the Union had embraced emancipation. Now that the Union, the United States, had embraced emancipation. Because, see, before the Emancipation Proclamation, the Union wasn't focused on freeing the slaves. The Emancipation Proclamation was a military strategy as a threat that Lincoln issued to the Confederacy, that if you don't come back into the Union by January 1st, 1863, we're going to free your slaves. Now, they had no authority to free the slaves. They had the Confederacy has separated from the Union, set up their own government, set up their own constitution based upon the U.S. Constitution, set up their own monetary system. So you can't pass laws that impact them. Now, you can go and conquer them and bring them back into the Union and free the slaves. You can do that, but you can't pass laws to tell them what to do. So what happened was anti-government anger that white men had in New York against the Union, talking about now freeing the slaves, and they're going to take our jobs, and there are at least 262 skills, trades, and crafts that African people had in this country from 1619 to 1865. So our skill set was as good as most white men, in many cases even better. Okay, so the anti-black violence that was inflicted upon us in New York was driven by the resentment that the Irish would have to compete with freed African Americans for jobs in the city now that the United States had embraced emancipation. On the first day of the draft, on July 11th, 1863, the city was relatively quiet. However, by day 3, July 13th, tensions boiled over. Volunteer firefighters from Engine Company number 33 were known for their violent nature. Angry at their commissioner, they set fire to their own company house, which attracted an angry mob. Led by the firefighters, the mob continued down 3rd Avenue, ransacking and burning businesses in their wake. They focused on those enterprises known to employ African Americans, including Brooks Brothers, Harper's Weekly, Knickerbockers, and other wealthy businesses. So these white men are so angry at the federal government that they're talking about now freeing the slaves that they go and attack and ransack businesses that were known to employ African Americans. They also attacked the homes of prominent white abolitionists. When this white supremacist mob reached the colored orphans asylum filled with mostly women and children, African American children, this white racist mob began to loot the building, the colored orphans asylum, before setting it on fire. The 200 children inside were led out of the back by their benefactors and taken to safety. There were many accounts in New York City newspapers of black individuals killed during this riot, of white men protesting against the draft, and they're saying, well, wait a second. You want us to go fight in the war, and you're talking about freeing the slaves. They're going to take our jobs. And wealthy white men who wrote the laws, wealthy white men can pay $300 and avoid going fighting in the war, risking their lives. We're poor white people. You want us to go fight in the war, okay? And now you're talking about freeing the slaves. We don't have $300 to pay to stay out the war. Wealthy white people do. So now their descendants had an insurrection January 6th. I keep telling you, the January 6th insurrection is a continuation of the U.S. Civil War. The U.S. Civil War was an insurrection. Although there were an estimated 633 deaths, only 120 were reported to the police. This is in like 4 or 5 days of rioting in New York. This is the New York City Draft Riot, July 1863. How many of you have never heard of this before? This is the New York City Draft Riot, July 1863. How many of you have never heard this before? See all that superfluous BS floating around on social media. We don't deal with that stuff here. We have to deal with like real substance. Of those, however, 106 were African American. Of the 120 people killed reported by police, 106 were African Americans who were killed. One account by Ibrahim Franklin's one account of Ibrahim Franklin's death was typical. Ibrahim Franklin was in church praying. He was a disabled man who made his living working as a carriage driver. He lived at a home and supported his elderly mother. The mob reached him just as he was rising to his feet from his prayers and beat him to death. They then dragged him outside and hung him in the churchyard in front of his mother. Finally, they mutilated his corpse. This is in New York City. That's the North. You remember Malcolm X said, anytime you south of the Canadian border, you're in the South? This was in New York City. This wasn't in Alabama or Mississippi. Stuff like that did happen in Alabama, Mississippi. This was in New York in July 1863. Now, although the Union had won two major victories over the Confederacy at the Battle of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania and the Siege of Vicksburg in Mississippi, and there's a Vicksburg Massacre in Mississippi also in 1874 as well. We talk about that in the class as well. Colfax Massacre, Vicksburg Massacre, Opelousas Massacre, 1868. We do a chronology of history of 1865 and 1968. And it's like certain things that we go through and look at. And we look at the laws and policies put in place to suppress African Americans, to put us in the predicament we're in today, to understand where we need to go from here, to understand what happened in this history. And we also talk about the rampant voter suppression that took place, especially after Reconstruction ended. Now, President Abraham Lincoln was forced to send 4,000 Union troops to stop the violence sweeping across the city. They had to send in the Union troops to put down this insurrection in New York, just like you had an insurrection in Washington, D.C., January 6th. With the arrival of the Union troops, including some who had fought at Gettysburg, the violence ended on July 16th. One of the ringleaders, John Earhart Andrews, was arrested and jailed for his role in the riots. Several arrests were made, but there were no other convictions. How many of you have never heard of the New York City Draft Riots of July 1863? This is a deep history. So this is during the Civil War. To understand what's taking place today, we have to understand the Civil War and what happened after the Civil War ended. Because just as you have 49 state legislatures, Republicans of 49 state legislatures passing bills to suppress the vote. This is what they did. This is what they did in 1876 with the Texas State Constitution. This is what they did in 1890 in Mississippi with the Mississippi State Constitution, 1895 in South Carolina, 1898 Louisiana, 1901 in Alabama. They were rewriting these state constitutions in these southern states, these former Confederate states, to totally take back control of politics, society from African Americans, because we were voting and getting African Americans elected into political office during Reconstruction. There's about 2,000 African Americans elected officials who got voted into office, because African American men were voting, mainly African American women could not vote. So African American men, we were voting in South Carolina. The majority of the state legislature in South Carolina during Reconstruction were African American men. And then when you look at what happened in Mississippi in 1890, African Americans were the majority of the population in Mississippi in 1890. The minority population, white people, changed the state constitution to implement poll taxes and literacy tests to suppress African Americans and lock us out of political power in the state of Mississippi. I don't think they've ever recovered from that in Mississippi. It was called the Mississippi Plan. was called the Mississippi Plan. And they said, we are here to exclude the Negro. So if you watched Eyes on the Prize, the original Eyes on the Prize, and they talk about, there's a segment where they talk about the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and why it was needed. And there's one scene where they talk about Mississippi. And they said to be able to register to vote in Mississippi, you had to be able to explain to the satisfaction of the registrar one of the 200 plus sections of the Mississippi State Constitution. You had to be able to explain it to them. They point out which section they want you had to be able to explain it to them. A lot of those registrars a lot of white people who were registrars were illiterate. But that Mississippi State Constitution goes back to 1890. And the man who presided over this state convention to rewrite the state constitution, he was a white county judge named Solomon Saladin Calhoun. And he didn't beat around the bush about why they were here. He said, putting the voting issue bluntly, Judge Solomon Saladin Calhoun said, let's tell the truth. If it bursts the bottom of the universe, he said, we came here to exclude the Negro. Nothing short of this will answer. We came here to exclude the Negro. So we go through each class, we go through and analyze approximately a 10-year period of history. We look at laws and policies put in place. We look at our successes as well and in industries that we're building and businesses, things like this, but also methods that were used to take away land from us. How we get locked out of voting. And all you got to do, you go study what happened in the 1890s and early 1900s. The same thing's happening right now in state legislatures. Except back then, we had more sense and realized, oh, they're suppressing our vote. We have more. Today, some of us so distracted with Instagram and Real Housewives and Love and Hip Hop and all stuff like this. We don't realize that they're doing the same thing that they did after Reconstruction ended. But now you have a declining population of white people in this country. And all you have to do is look at the results of the latest census, 2020 census. The population of white people in this country dropped below 60% for the first time since 1790 when the first census was taken. Now, they knew these trends were coming. This is why they're fighting tooth and nail to, one, maintain control of state legislatures, two, implement voter restriction bills so they can then take back control of the U.S. House of Representatives and U.S. Senate, and also maintain control of state legislatures. And there's Democratic governors that they're trying to knock out as well in the 2022 midterm elections also. So a people's history and culture teaches them how to deal with the problems of the past and the present and the future to meet the needs of the community. When we start seeing what happened and how we were attacked in the past, then we start better understanding what's going on today. And it's not about a political party, even though most of this stuff is coming from Republicans. It's not about political party. It's about understanding white supremacy and racism, really. And these attacks that are taking place, and this is in conjunction with the attacks on critical race theory. This is in conjunction with these false attacks on critical race theory to then try to shut down any discussions about racism, systemic racism, all this stuff, like in schools. Because you have a lot of people, you have like a lot of Republicans, they don't want this information taught in schools. Now, some white parents are fine with it. They want their children to learn. We talked about the study from USA Today Ipsos that dealt with how it was about 63% of 63% of Americans said that they want their children to over 60% of Americans want children to learn legacy of slavery. And they were talking about their children. Read this article here from thehill.com. This is a study from September 2021, USA Today Ipsos study. Over 60% of Americans want children to learn legacy of slavery. Okay. Now, a majority of Americans say they are in favor of their children learning about the legacy of slavery and the ongoing effects of racism in the United States, according to a new poll. 63% of Americans polled say they are in favor of their children learning about the lasting effects of racism and slavery in the country, while 30% of people polled said they are opposed to children's education on the topic. Now, that 30%, I wonder who they voted for president. Read this one right here. Now, so these are some things we talked about in class number 4. We're going through history, and we dealt with the end of the Civil War. We dealt with General Robert E. Lee surrendering to General Ulysses S. Grant April 9th, 1865. Lincoln shot April 14th, 1865 at the Ford Theater. I almost said Audubon Ballroom. We talked about Malcolm X also. Okay. We talked about Malcolm X, and we talked about Malcolm also in Understanding the Transatlantic Slave Trade, because I played the clip of Malcolm where he used the term African Americans from March 29th, 1964 in the Battle of the Bullet at the Audubon Ballroom, because the term African American goes back to 1782 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, earliest recorded usage. That wasn't created by Jesse Jackson. He reintroduced the term. Okay, so we dealt with all that. And then we talked about the 13th Amendment, ratification of the 13th Amendment of 1865 as well. I referenced the almost 2-hour interview that I did with Dr. Darrell Scott, history professor at Howard University, who teaches a class on from slavery to mass incarceration, because we talked about the myth that there's a loophole in the 13th Amendment that re-enslaved African Americans after slavery. All this, the 13th Amendment is based upon the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Most people never heard of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. That's what that's based upon. This law right here already applied to white men. They're giving to African Americans the same rights that white men have. And then in 1866, you had the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which then protects African Americans entering into legal contracts and different things like this. They're giving to African Americans the same rights that white men have. Okay, the 13th Amendment didn't re-enslave them. No, that's myth. And that wasn't even when you talk to abolitionists and you look at contemporaries at this time, things like this, they weren't talking about the 13th Amendment re-enslaving them. Now, sharecropping did happen. And there were state contracts like in South Carolina that said that you had to have labor contracts with plantation owners, what have you. But that wasn't because of the 13th Amendment. It's just like the convict leasing system. Convict leasing system goes back to about the 1840s in Alabama. That's before the 13th Amendment. And the convict leasing system is going to be short-lived. It ends in 1928 in Alabama. That's the last state to have it. But most of the other states had abolished it long before then, the convict leasing system. Okay, so there's some other things we talked about, but that's just a brief recap of some topics that we dealt with in class number 4. So this weekend, we're going to go through and analyze the Reconstruction period, 1865 to 1877. And we'll also deal with the presidential election of 1876, which leads to the Compromise of 1877. Compromise of 1877 ended Reconstruction. We're also going to talk about the failing of the Freedmen's Bureau, the Freedmen's Bank in 1874. Okay, we'll talk about that. And we'll talk about the Freedmen's Bureau, how the Freedmen's Bureau was underfunded, not properly managed. It did do some good, but originally the Freedmen's Bureau was only supposed to last for a year, and it's supposed to aid newly freed African Americans and destitute white people. If you're enslaved for 246 years, okay, now African Americans generally enslaved. Nobody was 246 years old, but if you have a people enslaved for 246 years and you create a bureau to help them after slavery ends, don't you think you need the bureau for longer than a year or 2 years? Because originally it was only supposed to last for a year, and then it was extended, and you know, it ends up lasting for maybe about 10 years, something like that. But if you have a people enslaved for 246 years, don't you think you would need like a Freedmen's Bureau for like decades? The Freedmen's Bureau, formerly known as the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, was established in 1865 by Congress to help millions of former African Americans and poor whites in the South after in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War, because you had a lot of poor, destitute white people in the South also. Okay, they didn't have a pot to piss in or window to throw it out of. You had a lot of poor, destitute white people. The Freedmen's Bureau provided food, housing, and medical aid. The Freedmen's Bureau also established schools and offered legal assistance. It also attempted to settle former slaves on land confiscated or abandoned during the war. They also helped negotiate labor contracts for African Americans. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped us to find lost loved ones that were sold off during slavery, things like this. The Freedmen's Bureau also, because they were putting ads in newspapers to help us find lost loved ones. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped us to get married legally, because this is one of the first things we wanted to do after slavery ended, was get married legally, because we always valued marriage. We always valued family. However, the Bureau was prevented from fully carrying out its program due to a shortage of funds and personnel, along with the politics of race and Reconstruction. So these are some things we'll get into in class this week, this weekend. Do this class on Saturdays. It's actually 12 noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. From the Civil War to the Civil Rights Movement and Black Power, 1865 to 1968. And I had to create this class because this class comes after. This class picks up what understanding the transatlantic slave trade leaves off, because there was so much information that I deal with for understanding the transatlantic slave trade, and I understand how important this period of time is, 1865 to 1968, that I had to create a separate class because I want to be able to go in and really analyze a 10-year period of history in each class. So that's what we do with this one here. So if you want to, if you like this type of information, it's going to blow you away. You can also use this with your children. Okay. I would say the information is PG-13, is not overly graphic or overly sexual or anything like that. I don't do a lot of cursing, it's not crazy. So you can use this with your children as well. Okay. We do a PowerPoint presentation. We have book references, articles, video clips. There's, this is another resource that we reference, especially in this class. You can use this if you want to take some of this information and suggest it to your children's teachers. You can. If you want your children's teachers to contact me and ask about resources, what have you, that's fine. We can do that as well. This is one of the tools that we use: Teaching Hard History American Slavery. Teaching Hard History American Slavery from the Southern Poverty Law Center. And this study is about a 52-page study, something like that. And it documents how the history of slavery is being incorrectly taught in schools all across the country. And then it makes numerous recommendations, really good recommendations on how to more correctly teach the history of slavery as well. Okay, so you can download that from splcenter.org. Teaching Hard History, American Slavery. Teaching Hard History, American Slavery. That's at splcenter.org. Okay, Southern Poverty Law Center. And they have a link there. You can download the PDF of it. Okay, I downloaded the PDF, took it to a printer, and got it printed up because I use it as a reference tool. Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries, who we've interviewed on this show, Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries, nephew to one of my teachers, Dr. Leonard Jeffries, he chairs the advisory board that put this together. So he's an associate professor of history at Ohio State University. Dr. Hassan Kwame Jeffries. He's the chair of the advisory board that put this together. He actually, if you watch Tiffany Cross's show, The Cross Connection on MSNBC, he was on 2 or 3 months ago dealing with reparations for Jamaica. All right, look, we got to get out of here. So you can register for that class. Visit our website, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. All this information is there. Also, all of my DVD lectures are there in digital downloads. Okay, AfricanHistoryNetwork.com. And you can register for both of the online courses that I teach there as well. Both of them you can, both of them I would say a PG-13. You can use with children as well. All right, we have to get out of here. Remember, at the African History Network, we focus on educating, empowering, and inspiring people of African descent throughout the diaspora and around the world, because right now it's correct wrong behavior. It's not over till we win. Wakanda forever. And we'll talk to you tomorrow. Peace.